Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you get a completely different result when you try to predict something, even with similar information? Today we're diving into a fascinating study about how reliable those predictions are, especially when we use something called decision trees. Think of a decision tree like a flowchart that helps us make a diagnosis or a prediction. It asks a series of yes or no questions to arrive at an answer. They're super useful because we can actually see how the decision is made, making them easy to understand. But here is the catch. Even a tiny change in the information we give to the tree can sometimes make it spit out a totally different answer. This is what scientists call instability. And it's a big problem when we want to trust our predictions. So, how do researchers figure out if a decision tree is stable or not? Well, they use clever tricks. One common method is called resampling. Imagine you have a big pile of data. Instead of using it all at once every time, you take slightly different scraps from that pile, with or without putting some bits back, and build a tree with each scrap. Then you compare the trees, if they look very different. The method is unstable. This paper looks at a few of these resampling methods to see which ones do the best job of telling us how stable our decision trees really are. The researchers specifically looked at two main things: how stable the selection of important variables is, and how stable the actual predictions are. They tested this on two popular types of decision trees called RPART and CTREE. RPART is a classic. CT is a bit more modern and tries to be fair in how it picks variables. Now, how do you know if your resampling trick is actually working? The gold standard is to compare it to reality. Since we can't usually go back and get brand new real-world data from the exact same place, they used a simulation. They created a whole virtual world where they knew exactly how the data was generated. Then they could create many independent sets of data and see how stable trees built from them were, and compare this to what the resampling tricks predicted. This gave them a true benchmark. Let's talk about variable selection first. This is about which pieces of information the tree decides are important. When they used a technique called bootstrapping, where they randomly sampled data with replacement, it told them that many variables were important even when they weren't. This is like a false alarm, a false positive. For the trees, this happened so much that almost half the time, the tree was incorrectly flagging a variable as important. That's a huge problem if you're trying to understand what actually matters. When they looked at prediction stability, which is about how consistent the tree's final answers are, things got even more complicated. They found that none of the resampling methods were consistently right. It turns out that factors like how big the data sample used to build the tree is, how much the different data samples overlap, and the presence of repeated observations in those samples all messed with the results in different ways. It's like trying to measure something with multiple rulers that all have slightly different flaws. So, the big takeaway here is that it really matters which decision tree method you use and which resampling method you pick to check its stability. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one type of tree might be a total mess for another. This is super important for anyone using these tools in psychology or other fields. What does this mean for researchers? Especially those in psychology. It means we need to be really careful and smart about how we check our models. We can't just slap a stability test on and assume it is telling us the whole truth. We need to think about the specific type of decision tree we're using and the nature of our data. The paper suggests using caution and understanding the limitations of each stability assessment method. Let's dig a little deeper into what these decision trees actually do. Imagine you have some data, like information about people and their test scores. A decision tree looks at this data and starts splitting it up based on the most informative questions. For example, a common decision tree algorithm called RPART looks at every possible way to split the data based on a variable and picks the split that makes the resulting groups as different as possible in terms of the outcome you care about. It keeps doing this, creating branches until it can't make a useful split anymore. Here is an example. We generated some data and built a decision tree. You can see it splits based on predictor x1, then based on x2. Each split creates new branches, and at the very end, called the leaf nodes, you get a prediction. Now, here is the instability part. If we take another chunk of data that came from the exact same process and build another tree, it might look quite different. Even though the same variables, x1 and x2, are used, the specific cutoff points for splitting can change, and importantly, the predicted values for the same person can be completely different between these two trees, moving from -0.34 to 0.72. This difference even when the underlying data is the same, shows how sensitive these trees can be. To try and fix this, scientists developed the conditional inference tree, or CT. Instead of just looking for the biggest improvement in a split, CTREE uses a statistical test to see if a variable is truly associated with the outcome. It's like asking, is this variable actually playing a role, or is it just a coincidence in this particular sample? If the test shows a strong association, it then finds the best split point for that variable. When they applied tree to the same data splits as before, you can see it produces a different tree structure compared to the RPART tree, even though it still uses variables x1 and x2. This difference in how variables are selected and how splits are made is key to understanding their stability. Now let's get into the stability of variable selection. The researchers wanted to know how consistently a model picks the same important variables. They used resampling methods like bootstrapping and subsampling. Imagine taking many small samples from your original data and building a decision tree on each one. Then they counted how many times each variable was selected across all those trees. For example, if variable x1 was chosen in almost all of the trees built from the resampled data, it's considered a stable variable. If a variable like x3, x4, x5, or x6 was only picked a few times, it suggests its importance might be due to random chance in the original sample, not a solid underlying relationship. The big question this paper tackles is which of these resampling methods gives us the most accurate picture of stability for decision trees, especially in situations that resemble real psychological research with small effect sizes and continuous outcomes, not just clear-cut yes or no scenarios. They specifically wanted to see how factors like the size of the data sample and how much the learning samples overlap affect the stability estimates. They even developed special reference estimates to really separate out these effects. In their first big experiment, they focused on selection stability. They created simulated data with different numbers of variables and different sample sizes. They used both RPART and CTREE algorithms and tested them with different ways of picking the best settings for the trees, like choosing the simplest tree that still performs well, or the absolute best performing tree. These figures show the results for RPART. Panel A shows how the tuning values used to control the tree size varied. Panel B shows how often certain variables were selected. The dashed line is the reference stability, what they expected if they had perfect information. You can see that for RPART, the resampling methods, especially bootstrapping, tended to inflate the selection rates, meaning they thought more variables were important than actually were. This bias was worse for continuous variables. These are the results for CT. Here, bootstrapping also led to a significant increase in picking noise variables as important, making the results less reliable. Subsampling, on the other hand, produced selection rates closer to the reference, but sometimes a bit too conservative, meaning it might miss real relationships. The paper highlights that CTREE's reliance on significance tests makes bootstrapping particularly problematic, as repeated observations in bootstrap samples can falsely inflate the significance of a split. Then they moved on to prediction stability. This is about how similar the final predictions are when you build the model multiple times on slightly different data. They generated two sets of data, built a tree on each, and then compared the predictions made by those two trees. This table breaks down the characteristics of different resampling methods. Things like learning size, how much data is used for training and learning overlap, how much the training sets share are crucial. Methods like split, half sampling create completely separate training sets, so there is no overlap, but the training sets are smaller. Bootstrapping and subsampling involve overlap. This figure shows prediction stability for RPART. The pink dots are the results from the resampling methods. The blue diamond is a reference estimate, adjusted for sample size. And the dashed line is the true reference estimate. You can see that for Pearson correlation PCC, which measures how similar the predictions are on a linear scale, subsampling methods often overestimate stability compared to the reference adjusted for sample size, RSEDJ. This is because the overlap in the data samples makes the predictions look more similar than they really would be if the samples were truly independent. Split half sampling, which creates independent samples, did a good job of matching the adjusted reference estimate, RCJ, meaning it wasn't fooled by sample overlap. However, because split half samples are smaller, they often underestimated the true stability you'd expect from a full size sample, RC. This shows the trade-off between avoiding overlap and having enough data to build a robust model. Interestingly, their results here differ from some previous work. While others found bootstrapping to be quite good for prediction stability, this study, especially with data characteristics common in psychology, didn't find that. They suggest that the earlier positive findings might have been due to different simulation conditions, like using simpler data or default settings rather than tuned parameters. The bottom line for prediction stability is that no single resampling method works perfectly in all situations. They all have their own biases. The paper concludes that prediction stability is tricky and should be interpreted with extreme caution. The choice of resampling method, how the tree's settings are tuned, and the nature of the data all play a role. So, what's the big picture for variable selection stability? Bootstrapping is problematic, especially with kin-tree trees. Subsampling seems to be a better choice, giving results closer to what you'd expect from truly independent samples, though it can still be a bit too liberal or conservative depending on the algorithm. For prediction stability, it's even more complex. With no clear winner, split half sampling is good at avoiding overlap bias, but sacrifices sample size, while subsampling and bootstrapping have their own unique issues with overlap and repeated observations. The researchers acknowledge that their simulations, while realistic for psychology, didn't include everything, like when variables are highly related to each other multicollinearity, or when measurements have errors. These things could make stability even more of an issue. They also point out that how you tune your decision tree model itself can greatly affect stability. And this is an area for future research. How can we tune for stability directly, not just for prediction accuracy? The core message from this study is that we need to be very careful and thoughtful when assessing the stability of our decision tree models. We can't just assume a method works universally. We need to consider the type of data we have, the algorithm we're using, and the specific resampling technique. It's about understanding the nuances and limitations. What do you think about these findings? Have you ever encountered unstable models in your own work? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into fascinating research. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.